This is a presentation that I prepared for our state chapter's meeting of the Daughters of 1812. So I selected this topic because their research is into their martial ancestors and it's focused on a particular demographic. Prior to World War II, military personnel were specifically males on the younger side. We speak of young, we are talking extremely young by today's standards in some cases. Sometimes as young as 14 or 16, particularly if they were drummers or fifers, or if they could convince their officers that in need of bodies that they were older. And so we're also talking about the realm of relatively rootless younger men with little to no material assets, and also the chain of lineage stretching back to those warrior ancestors will also pass through generations of young men, the earliest born before records were very complete. So here is just an overview of how you might approach documenting males in the earlier stages of their lives before they had set up in life and become more visible to authorities. And it can be useful to anyone doing genealogy because we're all going to encounter that issue at a certain point. Now, I bet that you have experienced this frustration when tracing your ancestors. You're trying to find the father and mother of a man born in the 1820s or the 18 teens, and you discover that he married in the later 1840s. So by 1850, he's living in his own household with the woman he wedded a few years prior and only one or two children. And you're hopeful that you will find his parents by looking at previous census years, say 1830 or 1840. But instead, this is what meets your eye: a long list of names with a lot of hatch marks out to the right. No names are provided beyond that of the person who heads the household. But all of these tick marks on the left-hand side are present representing younger men in these families. And all the females are out to the right of a middle partition line there. Nameless, faceless, without definite characteristics other than free or unfree status, gender, race, and an age bracket, not even a precise age as we're used to in the later census. And so, although we frequently assume that they are all children or grandchildren of these heads of household, we can't really be sure of that fact, can we? These boys and youths, they could be apprentices, nephews, cousins, hired hands, and not sons, even tenants, boarders, or students. We have to acknowledge, in fact, that some of them are other kinds of relatives than sons or simply unrelated because we know that to be the case after 1850. Well, the implication is that the series of records we have relied upon most heavily back to 1850 in our research, the census, is no longer the lifesaver that we had come to expect. It's not going to give us an easy indicator, just a potential suggestion if one of our ancestors matches one of these anonymous ticks. And as we go back further, toward 1820, 1810, 1800, and 1790, the age categories for dependents in a household just get broader and broader until by 1790 there are only two of them: one for males over 16 or under 60, and one for males under 16 or over 60. So that's not very helpful at all. Before 1790, there likely will be no census at all, certainly no federal census, and we have only tax and tithable lists to help us, which rarely give us explicit names of sons either. Friends are going to have to turn to other records to help clarify who the likely candidates are for the missing parents in our line, and the census will only provide the broadest outline of possibilities. I mean, we cannot even be sure that our young fellow was living with a man using the same surname he later adopted. It's possible he lived with an apprentice master, or an employer, or even a stepfather or a brother-in-law or a maternal uncle, and that his father had died when he was young. Or, heaven forfend, dare we admit it, It may happen that he is an illegitimate child of his mother and that he lived with her later husband or an apprentice master because of that situation. Our normative assumptions about how families are constructed can sometimes lead us frightfully astray. Sometimes we have to work hard to suspend our assumptions before we can find the actual truth. The remarks I'm giving now will provide a whirlwind tour of where we may find the names of our young, rootless, and sometimes feckless male ancestors prior to 1850. Because that's another complicating factor, the general nature and qualities of many younger men of that time and of this time. The male sex is known in those turbulent teenage years and 20s for unsettled qualities, generally. Wanderlust, just plain lust, relocation to greener pastures, seeking out adventure and new opportunities, chances to accumulate property, to make a quick buck, to find a wife, getting into contests of masculinity with other males, proving himself, quarrelsomeness, fragile egos, reckless behavior, and general risk taking. Okay, I don't want to overgeneralize. Not all boys are the same, but most of them exhibit at least some of these qualities in their youth. They sow their wild oats, then they find a place and a person, and they settle down. It sounds like I'm judging, but I'm not. These very qualities of restlessness and adventure seeking, risk taking, can be socially useful just as easily as they can turn disruptive. And those societies succeed best which are able to channel young men's energies to socially productive ends, into innovation or economic competition or accumulation of capital or martial prowess, rather than just hedonistic, self-indulgent, or self-destructive behaviors. Now, life wasn't as open-ended in some respects in the 18th and 19th centuries as it can be today. Most people knew what their occupations would be from a very young age, and most would never achieve more than a rudimentary formal education. Most expected to have large families, and that they would have to be more or less self-supporting, but would achieve little beyond subsistence through their life. Some would remain dependent on fathers or grandfathers for a long while before achieving independence, and indeed some patriarchs preferred to keep tight control over their offspring, both male and female. Many would live on the same land as their forebears, but others would be forced to find a new place to settle, perhaps in those newly opened lands to the northwest or the southwest. Most would be farmers or tradesmen, or more likely both. But the pathway to stability could be rocky then, just as it is now. And because of mobility, extended families could end up widely separated. Since most of the links that tie people to parents had to do with property, we must consider what to do when a young man grows up in one place and leaves long before his father or mother died, perhaps going completely unmentioned in their last wills and testaments, ending up many states away. What happens when father and mother had little to pass on to their children? Nothing that the law would take notice of anyway. Or when families were fractured or forestalled by early death, poverty, or irregular relationships, what are the records most likely to mention young people and young men in particular? Well, it's true that if a child left home and lived far away from parents at their deaths, the parent may not mention them in a will. I mean, they might presume that child would be well established by the time of their death, or would be beyond the reach of their help. They may have given something for that son to begin his new life in the West before he departed, knowing that they would probably never see him again. There would likely be no record of that gift, unless possibly in a deed, but oftentimes not. Maybe some livestock or some cash or household goods. The will, when it comes about, might actually make a perfunctory mention of departed children and leave a small token, some, to obviate any later claims that that child might make that they had been omitted by mistake. But often it won't mention those absent sons at all. That's not the case with intestate estates, that is, estates that are left by people who died without making a specific last will. In that case, all the known children are entitled to a share, no matter where they might reside. And if they have died, their children will take that portion. And the same is true of an unmarried uncle or aunt, one without legitimate issue. That kind of estate is really great because it will mention all the known siblings and their children or grandchildren with entitlement to prorated shares, sometimes generations later, providing it as broad an outline as was known locally of the extended family. So that's why I always advise when parents are unknown as a first step to check every will and every estate for a given surname in the area. And furthermore, not just to check, but to make notes on each one, both to help with the process of elimination. I mean, if they're not mentioned and the other heirs are, you know that they're not that child, the child of that person. So that's a process of elimination clue. And because the person might be related in a different way, and you'll need that information later. So in this example, we find that one of my distant uncles, Callahan Parker, a son of Garrett Parker in Montgomery County, North Carolina, had left home quite young, back before 1850, and he was never heard from again. So it became necessary, after his mother's life estate elapsed in the father's land in the 1850s with her death. Some 20 years later, that Callahan had to be declared dead since his father had left him an equal share of the land with two brothers. And if potential parents are known to have traveled south or west themselves, one must track them down to see if they left an intestate estate in their place of settlement when they died, which may mention any children they left behind. So you kind of have to be aware of the local people with the surname who moved elsewhere. They could be the parents if they're old enough, and you need to look where they went. Since dispersed families wouldn't always know that someone had passed away from whom they might expect a bequest, the court would mandate that a notice be put in the newspaper of record over 90 days, hoping that those individuals in other places would be alerted to their valid legal claim. Now, sometimes you'll find that a parent died when a son was quite young, and a guardian will have been appointed to handle the property on the child's behalf, if there was property, until they reach the age of majority. Note that for young men in general, that magical age was 21, as it is today. But as young as 14, they could choose their own guardian, so they may appear in court records doing that at that point or shortly thereafter. For young women, a fully competent legal majority came at age 18. Now, I wonder, why was the cutoff higher for sons than daughters? Could it have been because a youth was expected to take longer to enter into a relationship, a competence of property in full adulthood? Did authorities know then, as we do now, that young men mature more slowly than young women? Maybe, but also a young woman would be expected to marry and begin having children at a younger age, and she'd generally be married to a somewhat older or much older male who would then take over from her father or guardian and manage her affairs on her behalf. It's condescending it is, but that's how things were arranged at the time and believed at the time. The beauty of a guardianship is that accounts were rendered annually by the guardian as to how the property left to the child had been managed in that 12-month period. And that annual statement can give you an insight into their activities, their interests, and possessions. Look at this example for my ancestor Henry Quick, whose father died shortly after 1800, for example, in Marlborough County, South Carolina. This particular series of guardianship statements tell me that the guardian had purchased a horse and a hat for him, and also tellingly, he purchased equipment for his potential service in the War of 1812, but then he purchased, he allowed money or laid out money for the purchase of a substitute, so he didn't have to go to the war, suggesting that he was a little bit better set up in life, and maybe his mama didn't want him to go. I don't know. Sorry, ladies. His father was a Revolutionary War soldier for 5 years in the Continental Line, but young Henry didn't follow suit. However, you may find other details in these records. For example, not only purchases of clothing, but tools, school supplies, books, writing supplies. You may even find who educated the child, who the local teacher was, or if they went to college, whether a doctor was needed in a particular year, which would suggest an illness or an injury, and what trips they made would be mentioned. Some guardians give just the amounts that were spent and to whom they were paid, but we love the ones that go deeper and give precise details for each expenditure. It's our window into an ancestor's childhood, potentially, and certainly into their relationship to their parent, because that's where the money ultimately came from, the deceased parent. Guardianship papers may have been recorded in bound books called something like guardian accounts or records of guardians, or they may have been kept as loose papers in bundles, specifically as guardian records, and sometimes both. So check all of it. Um, Sometimes they're maintained within the estate file of the parent over the years and not segregated into a separate uh, series. But what about young men whose parents did not die in their youth or who came from unstable or marginal families? That, let's face it, that's a lot of the soldiers we're talking about. What other records also apply to those young men? Well, unlike females, young men were subject to certain duties and obligations to the larger society. The work that they could contribute was considered important enough, for example, that they would be ta- taxed on the basis of their persons, in addition to certain modest property, personal property usually, that they might have owned, like horses or cattle. Those levies were exacted through personal property taxation and poll taxing, that latter being a tax literally on one's poll or head, and kind of like an income tax today. Is paid for any able-bodied male between the ages of 16 and 60 or until the court released them from that liability. And it's really a tax on labor, but not on the value of labor specifically, just on a per capita per laborer basis. So that was also levied on enslaved people of either sex. And if you happen to be researching in a county where these taxes were levied annually, which is almost everywhere, and the records were kept for most years, and that's a big if because a lot of localities didn't keep their tax records. If you will see that young man popping up at age 16, and maybe he will be living in the same tax district as his father or stepfather or other male relatives at that time. His brothers may pop up in subsequent years or earlier years. And even if he moves west later, that proximity is in a tax list early on could be telling. The value of young men's labor is also shown in several other record categories. For example, they were coveted as apprentices to learn a trade even as children. So often the trade was nothing more than the usual farming, but it could be coopering or blacksmithing or tinsmithing or millwright, whatever. And this usually happened both to orphans with very little to no property and to abandoned and illegitimate children with no other means of support. So when poverty is suspected or known, that's often one of the first places they go. A typical apprentice bond will appear as a separate document, but it will also appear in the court minutes. And usually you should look for both of those records. One might tell you the parent's name, perhaps just the mother, and whether the child was an orphan or considered a bastard. The other record might not tell you quite as much, so you need to look for every trace. The age is almost definitely going to be noted, and the trade and the master's name, because the apprenticeship must end at age 21. Be sure to search what newspapers can tell you as well, because apprentices frequently ran away and their masters would advertise for them and give a pretty complete description of them, both physically, in terms of their clothing, and personality wise. And then there are road assignment records. Now, these are very plentiful both in North Carolina and Virginia. The public roads had to be maintained by male citizens, again, between the ages of 16 and 60, and their proxies. who could be either servants, apprentices, or slaves. And all the men mentioned on a list of road workers assigned to work under an overseer would perforce have lived within 2 or 3 miles of that road. Many of the men with the same surname in a single list or across that same road's lists over several years were relatives or cohabitants in households with one another. And you can cross-reference that road over many years to see which men of the same surname or related surnames appear over decades if you have good, explicit records to work with. You could compare the road lists with census and tax lists to see what older, responsible men of that surname were in the same locality and might be the father or older male relative of the younger men. In the South, you might also see young men assigned to the unenviable task of patrolling, of monitoring slaves found off their plantations. But usually those were the sons of slave owners and slave owners themselves, not unpropertied men. And then there's militia muster rolls and court-martial records, and they're another place to find younger men along with older ones exercising in arms under their local captain in preparation to deal with unrest or an invasion, which was a particular concern, as you know, during the War of 1812. These exercises would happen maybe twice a year, and those who failed in their duty to bring well-maintained arms or to appear at all were subject to inquiry and discipline. There are young men in the muster rolls who moved elsewhere before their parents died and might not be mentioned in their final wishes. Young men over 18 could also serve as witnesses to deeds, bonds, and promissory notes, and so the persons they witnessed legal documents for might be family connections, certainly people in the neighborhood where they lived. That's a clue. So compare these to other lists to place them geographically and in relation to potential kin. Finally, any boy over, say, 13 or 14 might serve as a chain bearer or on a land grant. Now, that's how I found the kinship group of Garrett Parker of Montgomery County, North Carolina, the father of Callahan I was telling you about earlier. Though he was living in a county where local records were burned before the early 1840s, the land grants are preserved on the state level, and we see him intermeshed in these records to the right with his brothers John and William Jr., all on the same waterway. Finally, don't forget voting or poll lists. Young men over age 21 were enabled to vote, and depending on property qualifications or lack of the same, they might be able to vote for lesser offices only, like assemblyman or sheriff, for example. Once they obtained land, they could also vote in elections for higher offices, like maybe senator or governor. I found ancestors in polling lists with other men of the same surname at a particular voting station, and I consider that a clue as to relationship, because why wouldn't you go with your kinship group to vote? I mean, it was also likely you'd get drunk, since candidates customarily offered inducements of potables at the polls. Even George Washington did this, and what young man could turn down free beer, wine, or hard cider? And actually, before I proceed with that content, this content, I'm going to mention that this is a polling list to the left on this particular slide, and it shows a particular election that occurred at a polling station in 1846 in Orange County, North Carolina. You can see the offices that were being voted for and who was allowed to vote in for particular offices. But in this list, over on the right, you will see my ancestor Aquila or Aquil Johnson. It looks like there's a number 6 beside his name there. Just before him, about 2 entries away, are Duke and Ransom Johnson. And actually, his father is suspected to be that Ransom, and Duke is suspected to be his brother. So this is an instance where coming to the polls together is a family affair. But in general, I want to talk about beginning in life. And I mentioned an area of legal records which indicate young men venturing into independent business, trying to get an economic toehold, and a competency to start a family. Now, it would be hazardous for anyone to enter into a legal contract with a child, but once the boy entered age 21, and even before, he might begin to venture into some legal arrangements for himself. Young men, often teenagers, will, for example, begin to record their flesh marks in courts when they acquire livestock, cattle, or hogs generally. Flesh marks are usually marks in the ear of livestock made to distinguish them from those of others, because for much of the year, most livestock in those days were allowed to forage freely in the woods and wastelands and mingle, and marks were the only way to distinguish them from the property of others and to prevent theft. When you see a man recording his flesh mark, he's probably quite young. He's probably just beginning to acquire livestock well before 21. Young men will enter into debt, usually borrowing money, but sometimes lending it, and they will be paid for work that they've done for others. They may do a lot of day labor. Those records may involve court cases to recover debt or in estate records of a creditor or debtor who has died. And if you look in the loose or dismissed court papers, you may even find their promissory notes as part of civil actions to creditors, as those creditors were trying to recover what was owed to them. In South Carolina, there are huge ledgers of judgments and summary process that involve very small interpersonal debts being collected. So that's a good place to look there. You may find that a young man used a security to guarantee repayment to his creditor, and that individual, the bondsman, so to speak, is likely a close friend or a relative who's taking a risk for the young man. And the witness's name to the promissory note may also be a connection, as it is in a case where the same Aquila that is mentioned in this record, my fourth great-grandfather, and a mystery beyond which I could not solve who his parents were, for sure. He executed a little promissory note for maybe $1.25. It's the only record I have of his name appearing alongside that of another Johnson male of his age or older in a public record. Turns out that person is the Duke Johnson in this polling list, next to Ransom Johnson. An autosomal DNA study has shown that this Duke was a close relative. Duke was a very poor man. At one point, he was even committed as an inmate with his whole family to the Alamance County poorhouse in North Carolina. Duke, or Marmaduke, later resettled in McDowell County in western North Carolina, and several of my close relatives who've done DNA testing show clusters which combine numerous descendants of Aquila Johnson with numerous descendants of Duke Johnson along various lineages. So this little record was not found in vain. Young men need to acquire tool, livestock, and household furnishings also to start a farmstead and a household. So where will they find these? Well, they didn't have very many stores. There were country stores, but they were expensive. So most likely they will purchase them secondhand, sometimes from the estate sales of personal property of deceased people. We might find them in store ledgers, and it's often instructive to note all the people from a given family who purchase on a given day. They may have come to that sale together as one family of neighbors. They are certainly neighbors of the deceased person whose property is being sold. And sometimes young men, they're of a more boisterous, impulsive character, and they get themselves into trouble. So don't neglect the criminal records, even if you're a little bit afraid of what you might find there. There are many assaults, instances of disorderly conduct, affrays, minor thefts, and sometimes worse, to plow through. You'll find young men being charged with fornication and adultery, unlawful cohabitation, and bastardy, which also helps place them in a neighborhood, and they may have to give bonds to appear in court. Who's signing on those bonds? Those are likely some associates and maybe relatives. We mentioned that unruly sexual energy earlier, just as much as in force then as it is now. And if your ancestor didn't commit a crime, he may have had knowledge of one and been summoned as a witness. The criminal records are just chock-a-block with good stories. Like there's one involving Solomon Quick, one of my ancestors in Marlborough County, and the theft of a hog whose severed head was found in the corn crib of somebody named Barnabas Skipper. Uh, the testimony given in that criminal case from the 1790s shows that Barnabas's sons William and Needham Skipper had knowledge of the theft and the concealment of the head, and it turns out that it's likely Solomon Quick's wife Elizabeth who was one of the Skipper daughters, and that these men were not just brothers-in-law but also partners in minor criminal activity. The places to look for young men's names are not always easily accessible. We've been talking about some of them, and some of them are pretty obscure, right? You may have a lot of skimming in archives and courthouses to do, but increasingly they will be more and more available with less and less effort. Don't neglect Family Search or the new full text search that is now powered by AI generated handwriting technology there. It's a quick way to search much of what Family Search has collected via the activities of the Genealogical Society of Utah and the LDS Church from all around the world. And every day, people are making startling discoveries because the AI large language models, once they're adequately trained and acclimated to a particular handwriting style, they're awfully good at getting it right, maybe 80% right, in English language texts from America in the 18th and 19th centuries. When a person's name is repeated several times in a court action or a sales list, for example, it that AI may get the name wrong 5 times, but if it gets it right even once, you have an immediate way in and you can look around and find the name in other places. There's certainly bet it's best to construct your search loosely using delimiters and wildcards. They offer you several, as you see here on the right, and you must try different versions of the name first and last in different word orders, but you will be amazed by what you find for a locality and a particular name. Stuff it would take you years to find manually. And you can search across country when young men are on the move and have a relatively unusual name. Don't neglect the opportunity. Sign up for your Family Search username and password today. It's all free of charge, and it's easy to find these incidental and obscure mentions of young men with their associates in some of these record categories. Many North Carolina civil action papers, for example, have been read, though not the criminal. All the estate files, for example, all the deeds, all the land grant surveys with their young men serving as chain bearers. I mean, there's no excuse to miss any of this. And going back to one of the examples I gave earlier, just preparing for this presentation, I found out that Callahan Parker has an unusual first name, did not die childless. He did go out to the West. He settled in Union County, Arkansas. He lived for a time in Louisiana. And he did have a daughter. Married late in life, had a daughter. He died having joined the Confederate Army. Actually, he was conscripted into it. Um, After Gettysburg, he was wounded and died in a hospital in Philadelphia. Till I searched his name on Family Search, I didn't know anything about his fate. I just assumed that what his brother Mason said about him dying without issue somewhere 10 years ago or so was correct. And it wasn't. Uh, when it came to the mystery of Aquila Johnson's father, we had a Bible record that showed that his father was presumably a man named Ransom Johnson. I found Ransom Johnson many times in local records in Orange County, but he didn't appear before 1828 or 9. He didn't appeared until 1830-ish. He disappears before 1850. I thought, what in the world? I mean, was this guy Aquila lying about who his father was? Doesn't look like Ransom was old enough, and there were a lot of illegitimate children in that family, and I just felt like maybe he was telling a lie about who his father was. Maybe that was another kind of a relative. But searching Orange County records, and I've done a lot of manual searching, but searching using Family Search, I thought I looked in every obscure place, But there is a record for Ransom Johnson in that same area of the county in 1804 bearing a chain on a land grant, which proves that he's old enough to be the father of a man who was born, Aquila, who was born in 1812. Now I know that a Ransom is almost certainly the name of the father of Aquila Johnson, and I have to go on from there and accept that my ancestor was telling the truth in his Bible record. And so you out there are not present with me, but if you have questions about this talk, you have the option to see me during business hours in the HRC where I work. If you take that route, it's always best to reach out and make an appointment first, because these days my schedule is somewhat erratic. Or better still, write to me or call me using the contact information on this slide. And you can also post questions in the comments field for our YouTube channel here, where I will get to it. If you post a question, I will try to answer it.